I opened a poll asking who you wanted next, and most of you voted for Alen Glenshiel, Teo MacDull's subordinates and former commanders of the Scarlet Moon Empire's armoured cavalry. As with many characters in Suikoden 1, the game revealed nothing of their backstories. Fortunately for fans of theirs, Alen Glenshiel's backstories were explored in a short story titled Amidst the Confetti, which was included in the Genso Suikoden Short Story Collection 1, a book that released in Japan in August 2000. This short story takes place primarily in the solar year 447, and it's told from the perspective of Alen. It covers Alen and Glenshiel's time at the Imperial Academy and how they became friends. Chapter 1. The story begins in the solar year 445 with Alen running through an alley in Gregminster. Alen didn't know what was happening, but everyone in the city had been making their way to the main street as confetti was being thrown out of the upstairs windows of people's houses. Crowds were queuing up on both sides of the main street, and even people from neighbouring villages arrived in great number to celebrate Teo MacDull's triumphant return from repelling the army of the city-states. Alen met one of his neighbours and asked him what's happening, and the man explained to him that this was Teo MacDull's victory parade. Alen overheard several people talking and spreading rumours about the battle. One man claimed that Teo defeated the city-state's army in a single day, and another man said they ran away as soon as Teo's army showed up. Alen remembered what his father told him about Teo only a few days ago. General Teo MacDull is so strong that he's never lost a single battle. Alen then turned to his neighbour, who told him that the Empire will be safe as long as they have General Teo. The crowd started cheering even louder as the marching troops got closer. A man in a yellow cloak passed in front of Alen on his horse. Everyone was calling out Teo's name, but Alen was left speechless and he couldn't take his eyes off Teo. The image of Teo and his troops marching through the confetti was burned into Alen's mind. As the soldiers passed them all by, the children chased after them and the adults returned to their lives, but Alen remained frozen in awe at Teo. Alen finally realised that the victory parade had moved far beyond him and began walking home. Walking through the falling confetti, he wondered how good it must feel for the soldiers to march through the streets like that. On his way home, he stopped in front of the gate to the Imperial Academy. He reached out and touched the gate and saw that there were soldiers from the parade inside. He thought that if you entered the academy, then you could join the Imperial Central Army and maybe one day march with General Teo. Turning his back to the gate, Alen continued walking home as Chapter 1 comes to an end. Chapter 2. Chapter 2 takes place 2 years later in the solar year 447 when a 15-year-old Alen had enrolled in the Imperial Academy. A trumpet announcing the start of class could be heard as Alen stepped forward and told his instructor that he's ready. He removed the glove on his right hand and the fire rune on his hand began to shine red. As the rune turned red, the temperature of the air around him began to rise. The heat emanating from the rune made his classmates take a step back as they began to sweat from the heat. Alen aimed his hand and a hot breeze flew towards a wooden target 10 steps away. The target became engulfed in flames and 2 boys rushed to put out the fire with buckets of water. The instructor took note of Alen's performance and commented that while his aim is accurate, it takes some time to activate the rune. The instructor then complimented Alen on his rapid growth over the last 6 months, telling him that he's skilled at swordsmanship, but advised him to continue improving with magic and to continue studying military tactics. The story cuts to explaining the Imperial Academy. Enrollment in the Imperial Academy wasn't easy. Selection was strict and applicants were rigorously tested on their fighting ability, academics and physical fitness. Only about 100 students were accepted each year, and not everyone who enrolled would graduate, as roughly half dropped out each year due to the severity of the work. Discipline was strict at the academy. Students weren't allowed to leave the grounds without good reason and were rarely allowed to see their families. Students who achieved excellent grades could aspire to become officers in the Imperial Army. Even those who didn't achieve excellent grades but still showed promise in certain areas of their studies could serve in important roles within the military, roles such as platoon leaders or magicians. Despite how strict the academy was and how low its graduation rate was, the academy received a great many applicants each year as it was one of the few ways that a commoner could advance their status within the Empire. Alen was inspired to join the Imperial Army after seeing Teo's victory parade. His parents were surprised when he told them of his intention, and they were reluctant to give their blessing as they were a family of fishermen with no noble or military ties. But after seeing his determination, they eventually agreed and allowed him to learn swordsmanship. After 2 hard years of training, Alen finally enrolled in the academy. After enrolling, Alen and around 30 other students were given runes based on aptitude tests. Alen was awarded with a fire rune, which he initially thought was useless as he wished to be a swordsman, but after hearing how some people in the Imperial Army are skilled with both runes and weapons, he decided to work hard at learning magic too. The story then cuts back to Alen, who is being approached by a classmate named Clet, who is practicing with his sword nearby. Alen glanced at his instructor, who was distracted by his other students, and walked towards Clet. Clet asked him if they'll be giving him a rage rune, and Alen responded by saying that he still has more training to do as it takes him too long to activate the rune's power. Clet cut Alen off mid-sentence and asked him about joining the Central Army. The other students turned and grinned at him as Clet commented that he heard Alen wants to work under General Teo. Alen replied that it's his dream to serve under General Teo and told Clet not to laugh. The story then explains the setup of the Imperial Army. The Imperial Army could be broadly divided up into 4 categories. The Regional Army, whose job was to secure each region of the Empire. The Regional Army functioned more as local law enforcement in the towns and villages of each region they were stationed in. The Imperial Guard, whose job was to protect the Emperor and his immediate surroundings in Gregminster Palace. The Imperial Defense Guard, who defended the city of Gregminster and its surrounding territories down to the fortress of Quaba. And finally, the Imperial Central Army. The Imperial Central Army consists of 6 companies. The first Central Army falls under the command of the Emperor himself, with the 2nd to 6th companies falling under the command of the Great Generals. General Teo commanded the 2nd Imperial Central Army. Clet wanted to be assigned to a regional army that was stationed in his home village near the Great Forest. Some students wanted to be assigned to the Imperial Guard or the Imperial Defense Guard around Gregminster, but most students aspired for high-ranking roles under one of the Great Generals in the Central Army. Most graduating students would first be assigned to regional armies to gain experience before being promoted and assigned to better roles in the Imperial Guard or Central Armies, but on rare occasion, exceptional students were assigned directly to the Central Army. Alen had heard that story many times from his instructors, but he was adamant and made it clear to everyone that he would work under General Teo. As Alen and Clet were speaking, the tips of their hair began to raise. They heard a loud noise and turned to see the wooden target for magic training had been split in 2. Students all around gasped and could be heard commenting that it's the power of the lightning rune. Alen saw a boy bowing before the instructor and muttered the name Glenshiel. Alen and Glenshiel enrolled at the same time 6 months ago. Since then, Alen had a good relationship with most of the other students, but Glenshiel didn't. Glenshiel was smart and excelled at military tactics and other academic subjects. Instructors praised him for his mind, but his cold and standoffish attitude towards the other students didn't make him many friends. Alan's impression of Glenshiel was no different. In terms of magic, they were considered to be about equal, but with Glenshiel having a slight advantage. Alen was considered the better swordsman, but when it came to academics, Glenshiel excelled. The two would often clash over their opinions on strategies. Alen preferred to attack, while Glenshiel preferred to focus on defense before waiting for an opening to counter. For Alen, Glenshiel wasn't someone that he wanted as an enemy, but Glenshiel wasn't the type of person to easily become friends with. Glenshiel also never told anyone where he wanted to be assigned after graduation, which greatly annoyed the other students. Alen and Clet spoke to each other about how talented Glenshiel is at magic, and Alen wondered how he could improve his own magic to surpass Glenshiel. Alen clenched his right hand and made eye contact with Glenshiel. Glenshiel approached him and complimented him on his skill with the fire rune. Alen struggled to take Glenshiel's compliment and thanked him in a rather blunt tone. Even though he was just speaking to Clet about how talented Glenshiel was, he refrained from repeating that praise. Glenshiel gave Alen some advice on how to cast his fire rune faster before returning to the instructor to practice with his lightning rune some more. Clet jokingly asked Alen when did he and Glenshiel become friends. Alen shrugged at Clet's comments and ran to the instructor to practice with his fire rune while muttering that he doesn't want to lose to Glenshiel. And that's the end of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. Mock combat matches were frequently held at the Imperial Academy to test the students' progress. Rumours began to spread amongst the students that an officer from the Central Army would be arriving to inspect the students during the mock battles. Some of the students questioned where the information came from, and Clet informed them that he overheard a conversation between the instructors as he passed by their office. The students wondered who was coming, and Clet told them that he didn't hear much, but it sounded like he was no ordinary soldier, as he speculated it might be a captain or perhaps even a general. The students were buzzing with excitement the moment Clet said the word general. They began speculating about who would be attending and wondered if the person coming was going to be assigning new soldiers to the Central Army. One of the students commented that Alen is the most likely candidate as he held his own against the senior student in his last mock match and he's the only one that has a chance to defeat them. Another student commented that it might be difficult for Alen to win against the senior students, but if he shows his skill it will certainly catch the eye of the Central Army. Glenshiel could be heard coldly saying, "That's ridiculous." Alen replied by asking what was ridiculous. Glenshiel responded by saying that it's impossible to be assigned to the Central Army just for showing skill in a mock match. Alen didn't like being spoken to in such a manner, especially since Glenshiel was reading a book and wasn't even paying attention to him. Alen glared at Glenshiel, who then slammed his book down onto his desk. Alen told Glenshiel that everyone is motivated and not to rain on their parade with his negative thoughts. Glenshiel responded by telling him that it's better to go into the mock fights without any expectations, as no army selects officers based solely on swordsmanship, especially the Central Army. Glenshiel reminded the other students not to get overexcited. Alen reacted angrily to Glenshiel's comments and grabbed him by the chest, but the other students swiftly stepped in and stopped him from doing anything rash. Alen let go of Glenshiel and took a deep breath to calm himself. He told Glenshiel that the Central Army needs people good at swordsmanship too, that it's the job of strategists to think about tactics, not officers and soldiers. He added, "Maybe you can't join just because of swordsmanship, but you can't become an officer just because you're smart either." Glenshiel frowned at Alen, and Alen worried he went too far, but he couldn't bring himself to apologise. Instead, he told Glenshiel that it's his dream to join the Central Army and be assigned to General Teo's army, and that he'll use his sword to make his dreams come true. Prompted by a friend, Alen then walked away from Glenshiel to prepare for class. Glenshiel whispered to Alen in a voice too low to reach his ears that if he thinks like that, then he won't be able to win any matches. The story then cuts ahead a few days to the mock matches. Participating students wore armour and fought with blunt blades. Use of magic was forbidden as the purpose of the mock fights was to check on the students' progress in swordsmanship. Only around half of the students attending the academy participated in the mock fights, as those aspiring to be tacticians or magicians withdrew. 2 students put the tip of their blades together. Alen, who was muscular and well trained, was facing off against a smaller, more agile student. Alen quickly overpowered him and won the fight. The students watching let out a cheer and Alen bowed his head to his opponent. Alen returned to his seat and the students around him praised him for his skill and told him that he's going to beat the seniors. Alen wiped the sweat from his forehead and turned his attention to the instructors' seats. He couldn't spot any generals as the students had speculated about, only a few men who seemed to be officers but looked too young to be captains. Alen wondered if they're really from the Central Army. Alen turned his attention back to the arena as an instructor announced we have a winner. Alen looked at the winner and was shocked to see it was Glenshiel. Glenshiel normally lost in the first round, but he has now won 2 fights in a row. Glenshiel took a seat nearby and Alen complimented him on becoming stronger, but reminded him of his own words that swordsmanship alone isn't enough. Glenshiel agreed with him, but told Alen that just because he said you shouldn't go into a fight with an overexcited mindset, it doesn't mean you should give up. He then told Alen that he didn't understand what he was trying to tell him before and commented how impatient he is, that if he doesn't calm down he'll trip himself up. Alen then turned back to his friends to watch the next fight. The instructors and his fellow students all raved about Alen's matches today, but Alen didn't feel the same. He wondered if Glenshiel was right about him being impatient, but the biggest cause of his impatience was Glenshiel, as he was improving with his sword much better than Alen had anticipated. Even though the other students felt that Alen would get assigned to the Central Army, Alen began thinking that if the officers were to inspect them, perhaps they'd choose Glenshiel over him, as he's not only good with a sword, but he's also smart and good with magic. Alen wanted to think that the only reason Glenshiel won his first two fights was because he was facing off against his own classmates. Glenshiel's next opponent was a senior, and Alen began to think that he no longer needed to worry, as he expected Glenshiel to be easily defeated and that the attention would soon be back on him. Many expected Glenshiel to be eliminated, but much to their surprise, he defeated his third round opponent. Many expected Alen to make it this far, but no one expected Glenshiel to. Alen looked at the match schedule which was posted on the wall and felt a chill run down his spine as he was scheduled to face off against Glenshiel in the fourth round. Alen became anxious. Glenshiel had rapidly improved in swordsmanship and was now showing almost the same skill as Alen. The instructor called Alen and Glenshiel forward for their match. The two most notable students were about to face off. It was a match that had the attention of not only their classmates but also the instructors and the senior students. Glenshiel stood calmly before Alen as if he was telling himself that Alen wouldn't be a problem, and his calm demeanour frustrated Alen. Alen thought to himself that he couldn't stand the thought of losing to Glenshiel, but if he defeats him, the instructors and officers from the Central Army would find his skill to be noteworthy. Sweat began to drip down Alen's hands into his leather gloves. The fight hadn't even started yet, and it was exactly as Glenshiel said. Alen was tripping himself up in his overexcitement. The instructor gave the signal to commence the match, and Alen charged at Glenshiel as if he was trying to end it with a single blow. Alen raised his sword and swung it downward, but Glenshiel dodged to the side. Before the tip of his blade could hit the ground, Alen swung his blade diagonally, but Glenshiel deflected the attack. Alen leapt backwards to avoid a counter-attack, and the crowd erupted with cheers at the exciting start to the match. Alen repositioned his sword, expecting a counter-attack from Glenshiel, but Glenshiel kept his distance and stared into Alen's eyes. Alen grew frustrated at Glenshiel's plan to bait him, and trying not to give him any time to form a strategy, Alen once again charged Glenshiel, lunging towards him and swinging his sword several times. Each time Glenshiel deflected one of Alen's attacks, he took a step back to create some distance between himself and Alen. Alen no longer cared if he lost any matches after this one, as long as he didn't lose to Glenshiel. Alen continued his relentless offensive, not giving Glenshiel a chance to catch his footing. Alen lunged forward and Glenshiel blocked his attack with his sword. In a disappointed tone, Glenshiel told Alen, "I told you not to be impatient," and before Alen even realised what was happening, he felt a sword pressed against his hand and the match was over. Alen stared at his hand dumbfounded. His hand ached and the blade that was supposed to be in his hand now lay at his feet. The students and instructors watching erupted with applause and cheers. Alen fell to his knees in disappointment as he muttered he couldn't believe he lost. Glenshiel asked him if he knew why he lost, and Alen replied, "What?" Glenshiel told him that he didn't win the match because he's special, he won the match because his opponent was Alen, and he could read Alen like a book. Glenshiel would then be eliminated from the tournament in the next round by a senior student that Alen had defeated many times before. And that's the end of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. Chapter 4 takes place later that night as Alen is laying in bed thinking about his match against Glenshiel. Alen reflected on the fight and realised the reason he didn't win was because he was impatient and in a rush to end the fight as fast as possible. Alen looked down from his bunk and asked Clet if there was something wrong with him today. Clet responded by telling Alen that he was a little more enthusiastic than usual, but he was unlucky to lose and that it was a fluke that Glenshiel had won. Alen jumped off his bed and opened the door. Clet told him that it's almost time for lights out, but Alen walked into the hallway and began knocking on a door. A boy answered the door and Alen told him that he needed to speak with Glenshiel. Glenshiel put his book down on the desk and walked towards the door. Alen told him that there's something he needed to discuss with him and asked him to follow him for a moment. Glenshiel asked him where they're going and reminded Alen that they'll be in trouble if they miss lights out. Alen told Glenshiel to come on as he walked down the hallway. He led Glenshiel to the practice arena and picked up 2 swords. Glenshiel was confused and Alen asked him to fight him again as he's sure he'll win this time. Glenshiel responded that it's meaningless and begun walking away. Alen shouted at him not to run away. Glenshiel responded that a duel is the same as a fight and those who are caught will be punished. Alen responded by asking Glenshiel to wait and telling him that he couldn't accept the fact that he lost their fight earlier because he was rushing and being impatient. Glenshiel stopped and Alen told him this wasn't a fight, but practice. Glenshiel turned around and agreed to the duel. Alen gripped his sword with both hands and charged at Glenshiel. Repeating his movements from their match earlier that day, Alen opened by swinging his sword down from overhead. Glenshiel deflected the attack and Alen swung his sword several more times at Glenshiel without stopping. Glenshiel blocked all of Alen's attacks but didn't attempt to counterattack. Alen shouted out that it was his own actions that made him lose during the day, but he won't lose so easily this time. Glenshiel smiled and instead of waiting for Alen to strike, he decided to go on the offensive himself. The two clashed blades and Glenshiel was thrown backwards. He laughed as he regained his footing. Alen asked him why he wasn't standing still like earlier. Glenshiel responded by telling Alen that he doesn't stand still, and if it wasn't for the relentless pressure during their fight earlier, maybe he could have won. Glenshiel then went on the attack and Alen jumped backwards to evade the strike. Glenshiel told Alen that his temper is short, and if he fixes it, his dream of joining the Central Army will no longer be just a dream. Alen asked him if he's trying to catch him off guard, and Glenshiel responded by telling him that he's putting himself at a disadvantage by telling Alen his weaknesses. He then told Alen that he can't afford to lose either, as he's also aiming to join the Central Army. Alen was about to ask Glenshiel a question, but Glenshiel charged at him. Alen reflexively swung his sword to deflect the attack and knocked Glenshiel's sword from his hands. Glenshiel picked up his sword and asked Alen if he wants another match. Alen shook his head and put his sword away. Seeing something off about Glenshiel's movement, Alen rushed over to him and saw that his right arm had been cut. Glenshiel insisted he was okay and that it was just a scratch. Alen told Glenshiel that it was wrong of him to do something like this. He admitted to Glenshiel that he was right about him having a short temper, and today's match made him realise how vulnerable he is to pressure. He recognised that Glenshiel sensed his nerves during the match and took advantage of his temper. Alen then commented about Glenshiel's plans to also join the Central Army. As the two were walking back to their dormitory, Glenshiel told Alen that his father brought him to Gregminster 2 years ago during a parade, and he became overwhelmed when he saw the sight of soldiers marching through the streets under the confetti. Alen commented, "Tio's victory parade?" Glenshiel responded that when he saw the parade, he knew he wanted to join the Central Army. His parents were vehemently against the idea, so he taught himself swordsmanship and military tactics while trying many times to persuade his parents to allow him to attend the academy. Glenshiel's story surprised Alen, as the parade was the exact same thing that inspired him to want to join the army. Glenshiel told Alen that he wanted to quit the academy when he heard that graduating students are rarely assigned directly to the Central Army, but he was motivated to stay when another student declared he'd join the Central Army. It wasn't just any student who spoke without the ability to back it up, it was someone who had the skills and was always trying to improve. Glenshiel looked at Alen and smiled as he told Alen that he motivated him to work harder. Glenshiel then told Alen that if they were to be judged right now, he'd be the frontrunner to be assigned to the Central Army. He continued by saying that there's still a year and a half to go until graduation, and there's still plenty of time for him to catch up and overtake Alen. Alen responded that he doesn't know, as Glenshiel is far more intelligent than him, and he's not going to let Glenshiel pull so far ahead of him. The two had been motivating each other to improve without the other knowing for the past 6 months. The two shook hands and agreed to help each other improve as the trumpet announcing lights out begun to echo throughout the academy. And that's it for Alen and Glenshiel's backstory. As I mentioned at the beginning, this backstory came from a short story titled Amidst the Confetti from the Genso Suikoden Short Story Collection 1 that released in Japan in August 2000. There are only 7 more short stories to cover from the books. We're nearing the end, and if you've been waiting on any specific character from the remaining stories, you won't have to wait much longer. Based on the results of a poll I posted the other day, the next video will be covering Varkas and Sidonia's backstory, then after that it will be Meg and then Klaus. If there are any other Suikoden or non-related Suikoden topics you want me to make videos on after I work my way through all of these short stories, do let me know. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.